Hi, welcome to episode 3 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. I have had several requests for discussion topics come in about modifications to sweaters. So today's episode is going to kick off a multi-episode series where we talk about different modifications that you could make to sweaters that you're knitting. And today we're going to start with a drop shoulder style sweater. Mostly because I think it's the easiest to make modifications to for sleeves, and that's specifically what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about a bottom-up, worked in the round, yoked or drop shoulder style sweater. So you knit the body in the round and then separate at the underarms and knit the front and the back of the yoke flat. So I am wearing one of those today. And this is actually the Daily by Andrea Mowry, and I knit this up in UU Yarns Baba Bulky in two of my favorite neutral colorways of hers. So the armhole edges, if you look here, this is the armhole edge here, is the same width as the body. So the armhole edge is here, the side of the body is here. So if I was to lay this flat, the width of the shoulders is the same width as the body. And we modify that by changing how long we knit the yoke. So the depth of the yoke that we knit, so from the separation up to the shoulder, is half of the circumference of the armhole. So basically the depth of your yoke is what sets your upper armhole circumference. Yeah, that's how I wanted to say that. Okay, so a typical drop shoulder style sweater, just like this, really has no armhole shaping. There's no stitches that get bound off at the underarm. There's no decreases. It's just a straight vertical edge. And so that's why I think it's the easiest. You're not having to take into account any kind of shaping. So what I've done is I've created a schematic of a sort of typical drop shoulder style sweater. There's a link in the description below the video so you can download the JPEG and look at it with me. I'm going to have it here up on the screen for just a second so you can take a look at what I'm going to be talking about. The schematic is just for 3 sizes, just for the purposes of talking about how to modify. And this is a made-up sweater. These dimensions are not from any particular pattern. But so we'll say it's 3 sizes. We'll say size 1 is the smallest, size 2 is the middle, and size 3 is the largest. And for the purposes of this example, we're going to imagine that we're knitting a size 2 sweater. So let's jump right into the schematic. So for size 2, if we look at the full armhole depth, so where you're stopping at the underarm, so separating the body at the underarm to the shoulder point is 6 inches, which means that the full armhole circumference is double that. So your full upper arm circumference is going to be 12 inches by the time you seam the shoulder. But let's say you're knitting size 2 and your 40-inch body circumference is right, but the 12-inch upper arm circumference is not what you need. So that's what today's videos are going to be all about, talking about how to modify the sleeves to fit the body size of sweater that you want. So with a drop shoulder style sweater, there are, in my opinion, 2 ways to go about making modifications to the sleeves. One is easier than the other. But neither is more right or more wrong. So I will discuss both options and you can choose what works best for you. So option 1, what I think of as the easier option, is to use an existing size that's already in the pattern so you don't really have to do any math. So if we go back to the schematic, let's say you're making the size 2 sweater, as we already discussed, but you want your sleeves to be the size listed for size 3. To make the difference between these 2 sizes, when you're knitting flat, so when you separate the body from working in the round to start working flat for the yoke, what you're going to be doing is adding this extra length to the yoke worked flat before you seam the shoulders. It's not knit in the body portion. It's once you separate for the yoke. So, for example, going back to the schematic, we're going to rely heavily on that today. The armhole depth before the neckline says it's a 4.5 inch depth for size 2 and a 5.25 inch depth for size 3. And that's what makes up the difference. So the full armhole depth for size 2 is 6 inches. For size 3, it's 6 3/4 inches. So there's that 3/4 inch disparity. And so all you're doing is knitting the yoke that much deeper to make up for the extra circumference that you want at the armhole. So you stop at 4.5 inches or 5.25 inches so that you can then work the neckline shaping before you seam the shoulders. So once you finish all of the neckline shaping, having worked your yoke to 5.25 inches instead of 4.5 inches, you get the total depth of 6 3/4 inches. So fairly basic. You're basically just adding depth to add circumference. So when it comes to knit the sleeve itself, after you've made I should back up and say, once you've knit that extra depth and you know that your upper sleeve circumference is going to be larger, that's the only change you have to make to the yoke. You don't have to adjust any stitch counts. You just knit to that longer depth and you're done with it. Pardon me. Furnace is running a lot these days. So when it comes to knitting the sleeve itself, once your yoke is that larger circumference, you just then have to follow instructions already in the pattern for the next size up. So if you knit your body at a size 2, but you knit the depth of your yoke to a size 3 without making any other modifications, then you will just knit the entire sleeve as per size 3. So the changes are fairly simple. You don't have to do the math yourself. It's already done for you. You just have to decide what size you want. You know, I use one size larger, but every body is unique. So if you need to go 2 sizes larger in the sleeve, that's totally fine. Just make sure you have the yardage to account for the differences in circumferences. And then of course, if you go the opposite way and you want your sleeves to be smaller based on the body size that you're knitting, for example, if you're knitting a size 2 sweater, but you want your sleeves to be the size 1 sizes, obviously you will knit the yoke shorter. So instead of knitting 4.5 inches, you would knit to 4 inches. I hope that's clear. Okay, so that's the easy example out of the way. I think now what we'll do is talk about the second option, or option 2. Oh, pardon me, Moo's got something to say. I'll be right back. Hey, sorry about that. I usually try to shoot these videos when it's his nap time, but he's getting older, so he doesn't sleep as much anymore. Okay, so for option 2, for modifying the sleeves, grab your calculators because we're going to be doing a little bit of math here. So basically the alternative option that you have when you're knitting a sweater is if you want to make the sleeves larger, but perhaps you don't like the jump in sizes, you can customize your sleeve. So as we've already discussed, the depth that you knit your yoke to at the armhole edge sets the circumference of the upper sleeve. So if you knit your yoke depth to 6 inches at the sleeve edge, your upper arm circumference is twice that, or 12 inches in circumference. So if we go back to our handy little schematic again, size 2 is 12 inches, size 3 is 13, I'm looking at it here in the screen. Yeah, 13.5 inches. So instead of just a 1 inch jump between sizes, it's 1.5 inches. So if you decide that you don't want to go as large as 13.5 inches, but 12 inches is too small, you can decide what sleeve size you want that to be by 2 things. So you set your depth, and then you'll have to modify the stitches that you pick up for your armhole edge. So there's not that big a difference, but let's say you want a 13-inch sleeve instead of a 12-inch or a 13.5 inch. It's a nominal difference when it comes to sleeve sizes, but if you've decided that you'd like to knit a 13-inch sleeve, that means you have to make sure that your armhole edge is 6.5 inches total from the where you split knitting in the round up to the shoulder seam. So just keep in mind that when you add extra depth to make up the extra circumference, that you have to take your total difference and divide it in half, because you're adding half to the front of your yoke and half to the back of your yoke. So if you want a 13-inch sleeve instead of a 12-inch sleeve, the difference is 1 inch, but you want to knit half an inch extra longer on the front and half an inch extra longer on the back, not an inch on each. Otherwise, you'll end up with 2 inches in circumference extra. I hope that makes sense. If not, please ask a question and I'll happily try to clarify. Okay, so if you've added that extra depth and your armhole is now 13 inches in circumference instead of the pattern's 12 or 13 and a half inches, you need to determine how many stitches you need to pick up to make that upper arm circumference fit. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about gauge, which we talked about last week, and just how to apply those numbers to the sizes that you want your sweater to be. So I'm going to put all of this in the description below so you don't have to try to write this down and memorize it. But to figure out how many stitches you need to make your 13 inches, you're going to divide your target circumference, so 13 inches, by 4. And the reason we do that by 4 is because we measure our gauge over 4 inches. So let's say that our pattern gauge is 18 stitches over 4 inches. So we're going to take that 13 inches and divide it by 4, because our 18 stitches is measured over 4 inches, and that's 3.25. Do you call that the remainder? I don't think that's what you call it. The sum, no, the number that comes from dividing 13 by 4 is 3.25. And then you're going to multiply that 3.25 by your gauge. So you're going to multiply 3.25 by 18. I did this math earlier. I'm not this quick. That happens to work out to be 58 and a half. So you can't obviously pick up and knit 58 and a half stitches around. You can pick up 58 stitches, or you can pick up 59 stitches. I tend to round to an even number, just because decreases on sleeves are typically worked in 2s, and ribbing is very often worked in multiples of 2 or 4. It's very rare that they are worked over a multiple of an odd number of stitches. But just for this example, we'll say that we're going to pick up 58 stitches around our upper or our armhole to make our 13 inches. It'll be something more like 12 and 7/8 of an inch as opposed to 13 inches exactly. But it's a nominal difference when it comes to stitch counts. Okay, so now we've got our armhole circumference of 13 inches. We've picked up our 58 stitches to go around the armhole at our 13-inch circumference. And now the other modification that we have to look at, because we're using numbers that are not in the pattern, is how to work the intervals of shaping to get down to our target cuff circumference. So this is twofold, threefold, multifold, let's say it like that. So if we go back to the schematic really briefly, we'll see that for size 2 or for size 3, the target cuff circumference is 10 inches. So we're going to use that as our example. We can also see that the sleeve is 18 inches from the picked up edge all the way down to the cuff. This is a fairly standard length for sleeves. Based on your arm span, you may need to look at modifying that, but for now we're going to just talk about a standard 18-inch sleeve and how to modify for that. So we know we've got 58 inches at the top, 58 stitches at the top of our sleeve, and our target circumference at the bottom is 10 inches. And I've done the math for you, that's 44 stitches. So we need to get from 58 inches at the top of our sleeve to 44 stitches at the bottom of our sleeve before we start the cuff. So that means we need to decrease out 14 stitches. Because decrease rounds are typically worked in 2s, right? I'm going to show you, we'll knit a stitch, work a decrease, knit all the way around, work a decrease before the beginning of round marker, and then knit one. So we work 2 decrease stitches on each decrease round. So we take our total number of stitches that we need to decrease, which is 14, and divide it by 2. So that means we need to work 7 decrease rounds. Okay, so there's a lot of numbers coming at you. So once we know how many decrease rounds we need to work, then we need to look at the spacing between our decrease rounds to make sure that our sleeve ends up being the correct size. So we have an 18-inch long sleeve, and if we look at the schematic, we have a nice generous cuff of 3.5 inches long. So you're going to subtract the 3.5 inches from your 18 inches so that you know your total length of sleeve before the cuff starts. That's 14.5 inches. Now we have to divide that 14.5 inches by the total number of decrease rounds that we want to work, which is 7. So actually that math works out pretty nicely. So we've got 14.5 inches of sleeve and we need to work 7 decrease rounds. So 7 divided into 14.5 is roughly 2.1. It's a little less than. Much like you can't pick up half a stitch around an armhole edge, you can't very easily knit 0.1 of an inch. So what I tend to do is round my spacing decrease down to the nearest half inch. So 2.1 inches, I would round down to 2 inches. If I had 2.25 inches as the spacing, I would probably still round it down to 2 inches. The reason you want to shorten it up rather than lengthen it out is to make sure that all of your decreases are done before you reach your target length. If I saw the 2.1 as the spacing and rounded it up to 2.5, my sleeve would end up too long. So always round down, and usually to roughly the half inch, just because it's easier to measure. That works out to roughly 1 centimeter if you're converting it to metric. So you want to do it based on ease, like not ease like a sweater, but ease as in making it easy for yourself. Okay, there we go. There's too many words. So basically what we've now determined is we need to work 7 decrease rounds, with each decrease round being worked every 2 inches down the length of our sleeve. So that means that all of our decreasing should be complete by 14 inches. Because our target is 14.5 inches before we start the cuff, you'll simply knit only a half inch, it's not much, even. So I think I do see a lot of questions about what even means. Even simply means that you're knitting the same number of stitches. So you're not increasing any stitches, you're not decreasing any stitches. So you're just knitting even without changing the stitch count to your target length, in this case 14.5 inches. And then once you've reached that 14.5 inches, you can start working your ribbing, knowing that all of your decreases are done. Is everybody's head spinning yet? I know it's a lot of math, which actually brings up a really good point. I do see a lot of questions from knitters asking me as the virtual assistant or the designer to help them modify a pattern. And I'm hoping that today's example will give you an idea of why designers can't help everybody make modifications to their patterns. It's very specific to each knitter, and it does take time to sit down and sort it out, especially if it's a sleeve that has stitch patterns in it, right? I mean, the example that I'm using is stockinette stitch. It's very plain, it's very modifiable because it's just knitting, but if you've got color work or stitch patterns, it does become a lot more complicated. So just a friendly little PSA. When you ask a designer to help you make modifications, you may get a no as an answer. And it's not ever because they don't want to. It's just mostly because there's not enough hours in a day for us to help everybody, even though we really want to. And that's the purpose of this episode. So hopefully you've had a little fun giggling along with me as I've tried to explain the complexities of the math in a way that will help you feel comfortable modifying your patterns. And just thanks for being here today. If you need clarification about anything that I've talked about today, because I know I throw these numbers at you very quickly, please leave a question in the comments and I'm happy to respond. If you have other ideas that you'd like me to talk about, please feel free to send in the discussion topics forum linked in the description below. And come back over the next couple of weeks. In 2 weeks' time, in episode 4, we're going to be talking about how to modify collar circumferences and sleeves on top-down circular yoked sweaters, which I know is a very popular thing these days. So we're going to keep rolling with modifications and getting you comfortable with modifying so that you can knit your sweaters with confidence. Thank you so much again for being here. I look forward to seeing you next episode, and happy knitting. Hey there, if you're still with me, you can consider this a little bit of bonus content. I just wanted to let you know that this fun little hat that I'm calling the Learning Hat that I talked about in episode 2, where we talked about swatching, is available now on Ravelry. I knit this fun little hat up using 2 different yarns. We've got the UU Yarns Heathers, which is a worsted weight yarn, and the Brooklyn Tweed Shelter. And I'm calling it the Learning Hat because I learned a lot about hats when I knit them. I've been knitting for 20 years and I've knit myself dozens of hats, but every time I make one, I learn something new. So this pattern is for worsted weight yarn, and it's one size, but that's the beauty of learning. I'm going to be talking about this pattern in an upcoming episode and how you can modify it to fit different weights of yarn or fit your head if it's a different size than mine. So check it out. There's a link in the description below the video with a little discount code for those of you who are watching. Thanks so much. Happy knitting.